Ireland's history in the Middle Ages does not exactly follow the trail beaten out for us by other scholars who would call the period between the 5th and the 10th century the Dark Ages. For the people of Ireland, that is one of the greatest periods of cultural efflorescence and intellectual creativity. So why is it that Ireland is a bit different from the rest of Western Europe? Well, to understand that question, we have to ask, who are the Irish? The Irish themselves are a mixture of people from Iberia, yes, that means the peninsula on which we find Spain and Portugal, and a larger group, once extended throughout all of Europe, who arrives in Ireland about 4,000 years after the first settlers in Ireland, and those are the ones who really give the island its strongest cultural identity, and they are called the Celts. Irish people will often refer to themselves as being descended from the Celts. They are indeed, and they are also descended from the Iberians and, as many modern-day Irish historians point out, equally descended from the Anglo-Saxons, from, of course, the island next door with whom Ireland has often had very problematic relations, that being England. So when we speak about the Irish, we are not speaking about an ethnic unity, we are speaking about a cultural unity. In the year roughly 2,000 to 2,500 years BC, the Celts arrive in steady waves in Ireland. At that point, civilization exists, and we know that from archaeological ruins such as that of Newgrange, a very fabulous tomb in which the solstices of winter and summer are recorded via various carving techniques in the rocks. We know that the Celts' predecessors, the Iberians, were following the stars, and the Celts themselves were too. Now, the Celts were a very warlike people, although we can say probably no more warlike than any other people in Europe at that point. But their civilization was a bit different on a number of counts, and one of the main counts was the status of women. Women in Celtic society, and by the way, this remains so actually through the early Christian period in Ireland, women in Celtic society could divorce. In fact, women in Celtic society could divorce, and they could actually take the property and their own dowry back with them if they became dissatisfied with their husbands. Also, as opposed to Roman law, and I say this because we are often used to looking at the Romans as though they constituted the height of civilization, in Celtic culture, if a child was born deformed, if an elderly person had some problem of illness or infirmity, they were cared for. According to Celtic tradition, children, people who have a handicap, or the elderly, are in the same situation as the gods. They are considered to be blessed, and they are considered to be worthy of reverence. So Celtic culture, and what we're going to start calling by the time we get to the first century Irish culture, was one that was quite a bit more merciful with people who would have been relegated to the margins in other medieval societies. From the 1st to the 5th century, Irish culture, as we call it, really begins to come together. And by the time we get into the 5th century, there is a recognizable, strong Celtic culture, which is very focused on trade with the rest of Europe. This breaks the stereotype that has existed until about 10 years ago, that the Celts were a primitive people basically living in isolation. Nothing could be further from the truth. We know that Celtic commerce roads actually stretched from Ireland in the west up till Turkey in the east, and there is a possibility that some of them may have reached even Scythia in Central Asia. What traveled those trade routes? Gold. That was, by the way, one of the reasons why the Roman Empire was always struggling to conquer the Celts. And so when we reach 5th century Ireland, we are talking about a highly developed society where women had probably the best status that they had in any place of Western Europe. In fact, the Irish were so powerful that just like every other people of their time, they were going on slave raiding expeditions. And in one of the slave raiding expeditions in which the Irish actually attacked other Celtic settlements in what is now Wales, and possibly into northern England, a young boy was taken back with them, a boy of either Anglo-Saxon or Gallic extraction, it's not quite sure. We do know his name, though. His name was Patrick. Patrick lives as a slave with the Irish for a number of years, and apparently he was not badly treated. He flees Ireland by tradition on what is now March 17th. Of course, that is the day designated as St. Patrick's Day. But when he comes back to Ireland, he comes back as the priest who brings Christianity to the island. St. Patrick is, of course, the most important national symbol of Ireland and also a very great symbol of Irish intellectuality. And Patrick's attitude towards the previous so-called pagan polytheistic religion was a more or less tolerant one. Christianity was going to spread in Ireland not because it stamped out the pagan gods, as it did in certain other areas of Western Europe, but because it because it actually inserted their worship into the overall framework which Patrick had brought. Quick example, Bridget, the goddess of fire, the Celtic goddess of fire, worshipped usually on the day we associate now with Halloween, on October 31st, during the Celtic festival of Samhain. Bridget, the goddess of fire, becomes Saint Bridget, the goddess of the hearth. Lugh, the god of light, becomes Saint Lugh, associated with the sky. And it was precisely because Patrick allowed and even encouraged the formerly pagan Irish to build churches on the site of the old polytheistic Celtic sites and worship the saints who had formerly been gods. Precisely because Patrick encouraged the Irish to do this, transition to Christianity in Ireland was relatively painless, certainly compared to other areas of Western Europe. To close, I'd like to speak about one of the most famous books written in Ireland. It began to be written in the 9th century. It first comes to light in the 11th century, but we know that it was actually edited and put together about 200 years earlier, and that's called the Lebor Gebala, or Lawer Gebala, if we're going to pronounce it in Irish Gaelic, which gives the cosmological vision of the Irish as they saw it at that point. They very much saw themselves in the center of culture, and they saw themselves, in fact, as the successors to the biblical Jews. Hence, in the Lawer Gebala, the Irish write about being present at the time that Moses and the children of Israel went out of Egypt during the Exodus, and the book states that it was actually an early Irishman who told Moses about the Ten Commandments. This is particularly interesting because this is, again, showing the Irish self-image. In no way did Ireland look at itself as a backwater of European culture. In fact, during those centuries, the Dark Ages, when the rest of Europe was frankly submerged in chaos, it was the monks of Ireland who perpetuated learning and art. And one more quick example from that book. In the Lawer Gebala, it is stated that when God created confusion in the Tower of Babel, creating different languages, scattering the languages so people could not speak with each other and thereby become greater than the gods, it was, of course, the Irish who asked for the finest language that God had created, that being Gaelic. And therefore, when we talk about the Dark Ages, let us please exclude Ireland, because the Irish in no way viewed that period as obscure.